Hi, welcome everybody. Welcome to the latest CTO Craft Bytes. Today's topic is, so you're measuring Dora Metrics? What now? If this is your first time at CTO Craft Bytes, let me tell you a little bit more about this group. CTO Craft is a mentoring and coaching community for technology leaders around the world, focusing on supporting technologists in their leadership growth. Community members are over 7,000, and CTO Craft provides them with one-on-one coaching, mentoring groups, a curated Slack community, and events like this one. A huge thanks to our partner Swarmia for helping make these Bytes events possible. I'm Alexander Korzinski, a contract software engineer and a DevOps consultant. Joining me today is Otto Hilska, the founder and CEO of Swarmia. Otto, can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Absolutely. Thank you, Alexander, and great to meet you all. Thank you for being here. I'm a long-time software person. I've started coding when I was around 12. Started my first software company as soon as it was legally possible when I turned 18. And after some consulting jobs, started a kind of B2B SaaS startup called FlowDoc, which is a team collaboration product. Ended up raising money from Silicon Valley, sold it to Rally Software back in 2013. Then spent a couple of years there. After that, 4 years at Smartly.io, building an online advertising automation company. We went from 30 to 350 people over that 4 years. So that was a great learning experience. And we built some pretty great self-organizing product development teams with very mature kind of practices. So after that, I figured I'm going to try to help other companies also build that kind of product development organizations, and doing that with Swarmia by bringing data from development tools and helping teams improve based on that. So that's the short version.
Excellent. And that's a lot of experience. So from that experience, can you tell us, why should we care about Dorametrics?
Yep. Well, I guess looks like people already do, given that we have a good attendance today. So I think the interesting thing is really that previously it was a matter of opinion. Should you measure something in software development? Like everyone would have different thoughts about it. There were attempts at kind of measuring some code metrics and so on, but there was really no evidence of whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And with all of these approaches, it's pretty easy to come up with reasons why they don't work. So I think what the Dora group did is they applied this scientific rigor in studying what kind of modern best practices actually seem to indicate some kind of business performance. And they actually did a good job in surveying these companies and trying to kind of build that link between the good ways of working and what happens as a result of that. So I think that's great. And one of the basically how I would summarize the Dorametrics is that you want to make sure that you keep iterating as quickly as possible without breaking everything. So you have something that describes how well you're iterating, how quick the feedback loops are, and then you have something to control that so that you're not trying to go too fast and you're not kind of taking your production down all the time while doing that. So that's kind of the idea with these Dorametrics, which is kind of the 4 metrics that came out of this research. So really just maximizing upside while controlling downside. And I think it's a great starting point for this discussion, at least. And the first one that was really popularized and something that people actually know about.
Okay, excellent. So that's a great takeaway. So going fast without breaking everything. So can you tell us a little bit more about the flaws of the previous attempts to measure performance?
Yep, that could be a book of its own, because there are so many ways to go wrong with measuring software development. And well, one is simply the opinion-based nature of doing it. So for example, there is a bunch of Git analytics tools out there, and some of them are saying that if you're measuring one thing, measure code churn, which is kind of a metric they invented for seeing that if you wrote some code, did you also change that code within some weeks or months or whatever. And I mean, that might tell you something, But is it really a good thing? It's pretty easy to poke holes in that logic because, for example, it's really common that software developers get stuck with something. And one completely valid way to get out of that is just build something and then refactor it, which would count as code churn. So is that a bad thing? In my opinion, it's not. So that's one of the flaws. Then one of the things that people always like to do with these numbers is start using them against individuals. So start measuring which ones of your developers are not doing a good job. Like how do we kind of manage people based on this? And we've all built products. We understand how complex it is by nature. There are things around coaching your colleagues. There are things around making sure that we're building the right things. Not everything is measurable with these metrics. And even when it is, it tends to be misleading. Like if you want to measure commits per day that your developers are doing and kind of stack ranking developers based on that, well, ultimately, that's just about basically habits of how do you draft, kind of split your work to commits. And some developers like to do it one way and other developers do it the other way. And it's not really a question of who is a better developer. There's also all kinds of ways of taking whatever number you happen to have and then misusing that to manage people. And velocity in Scrum teams is one great example of this. So originally using story points for figuring out how much work should be planned for our sprints and kind of just keeping that cadence and using it internally within the team. And then suddenly that gets used for comparing the teams and saying that this team does 30 imaginary units of work and this team does 40 imaginary units of work. So is one of them better? You can't tell it from that because, yeah, the team decides how they want to score these features. So they also basically decide what the velocity is going to be. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. And just otherwise, I think every attempt to reduce it to one metric is flawed because there is no one number that tells you how well you're doing as an organization. So that's just not possible. I could go on forever. There's stuff around.
Actually, let's stop here because I think this is a good starting point to then ask you about some of the advantages of Dora. So you mentioned the comparability between the different teams. You mentioned that there is some value in those metrics. So maybe let's talk about some differences between the high performance and low performance in Dora. How big are the differences?
Yeah. Well, that kind of goes back to why should I care about Dorametrics? And the thing is, yes, the differences are significant. So just in the state of the DevOps report, it's basically, I think what they're saying is that deployment frequency is like 1,000x difference between the elite performance and the lowest performance. And with some of these other metrics, it's even several thousands. So yes, the difference is huge. And for me personally, all this DevOps stuff always seemed a little bit silly because it seemed like it's just about building good infrastructure for empowering your teams to do whatever you're trying to achieve. But I've also been in an environment where that's not the case. And I built some consulting projects for Nokia back in 2007. And there we did deploy every 6 months. And at one point, they even asked us to like burn a CD with the source code on it and kind of get it to the ops team and that kind of stuff. So
what year was that?
that was year 2007. And so even though DevOps wasn't necessarily a thing at the time, it still didn't make any sense to me. And it was very obvious that this is not the way to go. So, but when you see that environment, you understand the need to talk about these DevOps practices and why everyone needs to be doing them. But since then, as I've been mostly working with growth companies where all of the stuff has been built within like X number of years, of course, we've been pretty much deploying continuously for the last 10, 15 years now.
Sure. Right. So now you're talking about deploying continuously. So how come increase in performance or deployment frequency doesn't lead to decrease in stability and quality.
Yeah, that's a common reaction that developers often, or let's say in the industry, it's a common dynamic to say that speed and quality are the opposing forces, and we need to think them as such. But really, it's not about that. And the State of the DevOps report also talks about this as kind of quality and great infrastructure being the enabler for being able to ship quickly. So that's really the idea with all of this. Of course, it's also more complex than that. So developers might have a tendency of kind of gravitating towards these more internal improvement projects. Managers might have a tendency of gravitating towards more customer-facing things. So there is always this tension going on, and neither end is a very healthy one. So it is good to understand that you need to invest in this infrastructure all the time to be able to do well. And for example, even with so starting Swarmia, starting a new company, the first thing I did was talking to customers and interviewing some 30, 40 companies. The second thing I did was setting up CI pipeline so that we get stuff in production all the time. Because once we decided that it's time to start building the product, it does make sense to make sure that you are iterating quickly. So it's absolutely good to focus on that, so that to enable.
All right. So before we talk about the implementation of Dora, I would also like to ask you about some caveats about this research and perhaps some alternatives. Is there other research around measuring software development productivity? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So first of all, it is a survey, and you can fill this survey yourself. It's done annually, and I participated several times. And the problem with surveys, of course, is that especially when we're talking about numbers, like how often are you shipping to production? If you ask a senior leader, they will likely give you a slightly optimistic view, or maybe the kind of happy path case. It's probably not the same thing as what it happens to be on average in your organization. So that's maybe one of the big takeaways. Also, it's very focused on the DevOps practices, which of course comes from just the scope of the organization doing it. And it means that it is ignoring a bunch of things around building great products. So you don't see a lot of talk about product management and product design practices to make sure that you're building the right thing or anything else really. So I like to think as building products as a very holistic thing. And these kind of great infrastructure and DevOps practices are a very important part of it, but that's not all of it. So I would take it as pretty much just like any other research, helping you to build the kind of organization with the feedback loops that you want and so on. And indeed, it's not even the latest research anymore. So the same authors mostly have also published a paper about space framework, which is not it's not the same kind of research in a way that it would be based on some surveys and so on. It's more like kind of showing these ideas of how you should think about measurement. But there's plenty of good ideas there around exactly working around some of these problems that I mentioned earlier, so that you should focus on multiple numbers. And you should look at numbers at different levels of the organization. You should take numbers of different categories versus just relying on one to balance them out, etc. So that's kind of the latest thinking that these people have.
Okay, so that's good to know as well. So let's talk about implementation in the context of Dora, in the context of space to some extent. We can talk about it too. So I'd like to first ask you about some resistance. So what will developers think about implementing measures of their work? Is there going to be a resistance there, and how do you potentially overcome it?
Yeah, well, like anything that's kind of new and a debated topic, you can expect to see some resistance from developers. As we discussed, I think the good part about Dorametrics is that it is much more about the systemic things in your organization and in your teams rather than individuals. So that's a great thing. But the initial reaction of many developers might be negative. And at least how I like to take these kind of more complex decisions is really bringing it to the organization, talking about the background of why we're thinking about this, then getting everyone's input before moving forward, kind of treating it as a complex decision or kind of a change management thing. I think that makes, when you have those conversations openly and you have the culture that kind of advocates for experimentation and people have these blameless retrospectives and kind of if you manage to build a good culture, people should be receptive to trying new things as long as you're explaining the background of it and explaining why this is not about stalking developers. But it's a conversation you need to be prepared to have, because most likely if no one's bringing it up, someone's thinking about it and just not telling you about it.
Okay. Right. So then the next step is going to be, so say that you have access to these numbers. So how can you get your organization to drive some change?
Yeah, so there's plenty of attempts to kind of visualize these from kind of building your own dashboards from BigQuery or whatever to a bunch of tools out there. There's also plenty of caveats with all of those. For example, just looking at an aggregate Dorametric number is not very helpful for anyone. Like, what do you do with this one individual number that's saying that it's now your lead time for change is now 5 days? Like, is that good? Is that bad? What should I change for that to move to some direction? So it is really about going behind those numbers and using these as conversation starters. It will allow you to have better quality conversations when you base it on something. But if you're then able to go to the contributing factors behind these numbers and really see what's going on and look at your work through the lens of these numbers, I find that that's a much more interesting aspect, because numbers get boring pretty quickly. Like, if your lead time for change remains roughly the same over time, maybe it goes down a little bit. It doesn't really kind of keep the teams engaged. But if you're always able to look at, we just completed this feature and this is how it went, these were the parts of it that took the longest time and so on, then it's about the continuous learning and the feedbacks. So as a leader, you want to build these feedback loops to your team so that they'll be able to apply all of this data in their work. And just putting a number on some dashboard that no one visits, or maybe the VP visits every quarter, that's not really going to help you much. And there's plenty of other questions too around just the data quality and, like, can you actually trust this? Because one of the things that developers hate is after being kind of evaluated on metrics that don't make a lot of sense, what makes it even worse is if those numbers don't even seem correct. So you might be evaluated based on completely bogus numbers. So it is worth exercising some caution there and making sure that.
Oh, right, great. So my takeaway from this is looking at what contributes to those numbers as important, so to say, retrospective to look at once you have these numbers, once you have a good culture without blame. And then the second thing is the quality, which we're going to talk about later on today as well, when we talk about individual metrics and how to best measure them. I have a question from the audience about SaaS in particular. A question from Ants: do you think that implementing any software as a service could enhance the Dorametrics in general? As an example, automating the dev/test environments creation process results in TTM reduction and more. What would you say to that, Otto?
Yeah, I mean, these metrics cover pretty complex issues in your organization. There's plenty of things that could help you in improving them. And all this infrastructure around indeed anything from development environments to production environments to testing, CIs, everything, like they are all areas of improvement. And there's plenty of SaaS tools out there to support developer productivity in all these different angles. So yeah, I can totally see that being a useful area.
Great. Now, I'd like to come back a little bit to what you said previously about looking at individual stages. Do you have any specific advice on that? What to look for? So say that you're not happy with the results you're getting as you started measuring them. You see a lot of, they could be improved. Say that you're really far away from the high performance. Where would you look first? Or is that specific to organization? Or can you give general advice on what would you do next?
Well, typically where I would start first is just looking at the change lead time and what's going on as part of your process, because that tends to be the easiest thing to fix, because process is something that you can change relatively overnight, while some infrastructure and some quality issues in your code base and lack of automated tests and these kind of things, they will take longer to fix, and that's the reality. So usually there's already some gains to be had in that, just looking at how you do code reviews, how do you test your code, what does the deployment look like, all of these things. And one of the useful things is to have this kind of moments of success for the team where they are seeing that, okay, well, we did this and it actually improved our life, and it wasn't just something that our managers came up with. So it's actually getting that positive reinforcement for this continuous improvement is pretty important. And but yeah, then it requires just a lot of work and kind of a long-term commitment to work on this, because ultimately, especially if you have a code base that's kind of a bit challenging to maintain, then starting to work on, for example, automated tests, it might take years to really significantly improve the situation.
Okay. We have another question from the audience. At what level should Dorametrics be tracked? Company, department, team, individual?
Yeah, that's a good question. It might be interesting to track at the higher level, and it might tell you something about the trends of higher organizations evolving. But ultimately, there's also huge differences between different systems, different teams. And for example, at Smartly, we had a pretty typical growth company story where there was an existing monolith that had all kinds of challenges. It was the one that was, of course, most difficult to maintain and test and deploy. And then we had tens of microservices that were very easy to deploy and no problems there. So if you look at the averages, you get something funky, like whatever that ends up being. But if you look at it kind of especially at the team level and by system that they're maintaining, then you start to get some more insight. So I would really always look at it from the perspective of what are we going to do with this, rather than how can I put up this number that my boss asked me to put out there.
Right. So let's talk about individual metrics now, because we started talking about it already. Let's go one by one. So what does each one describe and how to improve each one? So let's start with deployment frequency. Can you introduce us to this metric?
Sure. So the way this is kind of done in the survey itself, they are asking for the primary application or service you work on, how often does your organization deploy code to production or release it to end users? So that's kind of where this data is coming from. And of course, in real life, there are different ways to deploy, different kind of, you release mobile apps in a different way than what you do with backend services and so on. So the world is a little bit more complex than what this might indicate. I think deployment frequency is interesting because it kind of has a double purpose. So it kind of indicates throughput. So you are kind of getting some volume of changes going out. It also indicates that you're doing it more often, so you're doing it in smaller batch size. But also then the kind of quality aspect is interesting because developers will automatically control deployment frequency if they are too afraid to deploy. Like if it feels like, okay, I'm not going to deploy on Fridays and maybe not on Thursdays either. I mean, I can't really trust this. I need to run like manual tests for a week before I can feel confident about it. Like no matter how good of a deployment pipeline you have, it's not going to fix the problem that people are not going to be confident about it. And it's interesting because confidence is a completely subjective thing. It's all about how was I onboarded to this? Do I trust the systems that we have? Do I understand what's going on there, etc.? So it's actually a surprisingly complex metric that kind of hides all kinds of things behind it. So it's quite interesting. And it covers things from, I would say the most important thing is your automated tests. So can you actually trust them? So if a test passes, does it mean that it's safe to deploy? And if a test fails, does it mean that it's not safe to deploy? Because there are examples to both the directions where you could have a problem with test flakiness, for example, and that would be a problem for understanding it. And I've seen companies where there's one person who's responsible for checking test failures every time before something goes out. And then that person kind of looks at the tests and says that, I've seen this failure before, so it's probably not very important. And let's go. And that's obviously not a very sustainable way to scale that, especially when things get more complex.
Exactly. So won't high deployment frequency lead to burnout? How do you manage that?
Yeah, well, ultimately, when you're doing, it's one of those things that if it hurts, you probably need to do it more often, even though the intuition says to do less. So, I mean, yes, if you're doing monthly or every 6 months deployments, then yes, it's going to be painful every single time for sure. But I can say that we don't feel any kind of anxiety about deploying our product to the production because we just do it tens of times per day and no one even thinks about it. And we've had enough production failures to cover from the most critical things. And if we just kind of keep fixing whatever is causing new problems, then we start to have a pretty resilient system.
Right. So this is a good moment to ask about good enough level for these metrics. So in particular, deployment frequency. So at which point can you say this is good enough and essentially stop focusing on it that much so that it doesn't become, in a sense, an obsession, just making it, higher and higher? What is the good enough level?
That good enough level kind of depends on your organization and what kind of things you're actually doing. But for example, with deployment frequency, if you are already on continuous deployment and so on, then, well, there isn't much you can do in that front anymore, or then it becomes more of a discussion of throughput, which might be then kind of better indicated by other things than just the deployment frequency. And so that's a good level for that. Maybe even more importantly, if you think about things like the change lead time, so how long does it take for me to get my commit to production? That's especially a metric that, since it's a number of hours or weeks or months or whatever, there is a kind of threshold after which it's not very useful anymore. So I would say, for example, if you're getting stuff to production on average within 24 hours, then you seem to be doing pretty good. And unless you get worse with it, which is also possible, because when you increase complexity and you hire more people, and like especially in a growth company, when half of the team started within the last month, then you are going to go backwards with some of these metrics as well. So it could be that you were actually doing well, but now you need to focus on it again. So it's good to keep it around. But after, like, once you're doing better than 24 hours, don't worry about it, focus on something else, like are we actually solving the customer problems as well as we could, and are we shipping features as well as we can. And so those become more interesting at that point. And if you are too focused on these numbers, you might even go to kind of micro optimizations that might be bad for you, because let's say you want to optimize the change lead time. At some point, you're going to be asking yourself, should I create this pull request this evening because no one's going to be reviewing it before tomorrow morning? And of course, you don't want to kind of reward that kind of behavior. That doesn't make any sense. And also, you don't want to get people to drop, like when there's a pull request to review, you don't have to drop all of your work and go and review it right away. I think it's okay if we do it within the next day.
Yeah, sure. This actually is related to a question we have from the audience, which is your idea experience with measuring cycle times starting from early steps in the value stream, such as from product ideation or Jira issue creation instead of from repo commit. So that also ties to the quality issue about these metrics. So how do you actually measure something like lead time for change, which you have just introduced? Where do we start measuring that lead time? And also, how do we measure it from such an early step in the value stream?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Most of these things are somewhat arbitrary. So you can kind of choose what would best describe your business and kind of give you the most actionable insight. And for example, thinking about the kind of discovery work as part of the cycle time, it might be helpful for someone. At the same time, the goal of a product discovery work is not to just do the research and then end up immediately implementing it and then push it out. Like, that's not the full cycle, but I would maybe consider that there's two a little bit separate processes. There's kind of a product discovery phase where you are able to experiment with ideas and kind of build this backlog for the development team. And then you have this kind of development process where you push out code to production. So measuring both of them might be interesting, but also in many organizations, if you just want to understand, I think it's perfectly fine to also look at from commit to production and focus on that, or even from commit to the main branch type of things, if you're focusing on, for example, on your code review processes. So whatever makes sense in your own context.
Yes, that makes sense. Let me then move on to the next metric, which is change failure rate. So again, first let's talk about the definition. What is a failure? This is something that the company where I work for, we discussed a lot. How do you define that? I mean, is it a failure when we had to roll back? What we had to roll forward? Meaning that immediately or very quickly after deploying one version, we decided, we need to deploy another one, and that wasn't technically a rollback. Does it mean that the previous deployment was a failure? So at which point does a deployment become a failure? And then what would be your advice? Essentially, let's talk about the definitions. Then, what can we do about it? And what would be the good enough level?
Yeah. Well, both the change failure rate and the mean time to recovery are basically about the same thing. They're just two different ways to look at the failures that you're having. And the way it's described in the survey is for the primary application or service you work on, what percentage of changes to production or release to users result in degraded service, for instance, lead to service impairment or service outage, and subsequently require remediation, like requiring hotfix, rollback, fix forward, patch, whatever. So yeah, it's a pretty broad definition. And maybe going back to the early parts of the discussion and the principles about this is really just about telling you, are we moving or trying to move too fast so that we're breaking things on the way? And there's many different ways to look at this, especially when you have multiple teams, each owning their own microservices, them communicating in different ways. It might not be a big problem at all if you have one service processing a queue that is now delayed by 15 minutes that no one might even notice. That might be perfectly fine. So it's more about what is, and if you have that kind of setup, you've already architected your system quite well because you built it so that there's this kind of built-in resilience in your architecture. And the fact that you kind of failed, but customers didn't notice, that was a good thing. So you kind of already achieved something there. And I think at that point, maybe you don't have to count that as something that would be kind of user visible. And there are many different practices around kind of service level objectives and this kind of things that help you define how, like, what do we expect from these services? Like, if I push something to this queue, when do I expect that to be processed? And if it doesn't, like, who's gonna be credited for that downtime? So it is really a complex discussion how to do that in a bigger organization. But you just need to design it for your own situation. Of course, the most obvious choices are looking at things like if you're using something like PagerDuty or OpsGenie and seeing kind of, do we have this kind of downtime incidents and so on. And even there, I would say the more important thing than the metric is just the fact that you have these incident review processes and you have a systematic approach to making sure that when we run something in production, we are being very professional about it. And whenever there's a failure, it's, again, this blameless retrospective where we just look at what were the things that went wrong, how can we build more resilience to our systems and to our processes so that the same thing doesn't happen again.
Excellent. So the good enough level, what do you think that would be?
Yeah, I mean, for example, I feel that our current team is really at a good enough level where, yes, we did have a couple of hours of downtime last year, but half of that was by a Google Cloud kind of load balancer outage. So really, you didn't have a systematic problem where things would kind of break all the time. This is really subjective because, yeah, again, software is deployed in so many different ways and so on. And maybe part of these measures is also that they might not describe your business that accurately. So, for example, at Smartly, we had a very big integration with Facebook. Like you were able to do all kinds of things on the Facebook platform through Smartly. We were a bigger API user than their own ads manager, so we were probably like globally the biggest user of the API with some like tens of gigabits per traffic per second and so on. So it was a lot of kind of back and forth. And so whenever Facebook changed something like a definition of an API field or something, we would notice. And so that's a failure that is visible to customers. And we had to build a bunch of tooling around this specific type of failure where something changes on the other side and it affects us, and we really need to fix that right away. And so we figured that that's maybe a much bigger existential issue for us than just the idea of deploying something that returns ever 500 to the end customers. So we just kind of built our company around being good at that stuff that we have to do all the time.
Got it. Let's move on to the last Dora metric, which is mean time to recovery. Can you tell us again, how would you define it? And by the way, there's something that I have also learned from you is that when in doubt as to the definition of those terms, it's useful to look into the definition in the actual survey, because that's the canonical definition of them. That's the definition used for the survey where these numbers are compared. So that's a great tip. Specifically about mean time to recovery. What can you tell us, first of all, how to measure it, the definition, and finally the good enough level?
Yeah, well, it's basically just the other side of the coin from the change failure. So, well, now we failed, we have an incident. So how long did it take for us to react and or not just react, but to fix it, which is of course affected by the other things. Like if you have very swift deployments and that's easy to do, then likely you're also able to recover a lot easier. And if you're shipping in small batch sizes, there's much less of a chance that you just did a non-backwards compatible database migration that would prevent you going backwards, etc. So all of these things kind of support each other. And I mean, for us and like in the industry in general, this shouldn't take long. Like if we should be talking about a couple of minutes when things go wrong, and you should be able to fix it. But of course, if the situation is that you are deploying once a year, and that includes a bunch of non-backwards compatible things, and your like process for fixing it is going to take a couple of weeks, and then most likely you're going to have to build some new functionality to actually fix it, then it's obvious that you're going to land somewhere in months at that point to deliver a good fix, which is possible, but you should really try to get away from that space.
Got it. And finally, you mentioned about latest research by the authors of the original Dorametrics and about the space framework. So what other metrics have there been suggested in addition to those four? So let me just recap. It was deployment frequency, lead time for change failure rate, and mean time to recovery. So what fifth metric have been suggested, or metrics have been suggested by the same authors or by other authors?
Yeah, well, actually, part of the latest State of the DevOps report, they had added this fifth metric for reliability. It is once again one of those things that's not necessarily very strictly defined, and it's kind of overlapping with two of the last ones anyways. So I'm not sure if that will become very popular. But I mean, looking at reliability is, of course, one aspect of kind of going or iterating as quickly as you can without breaking production. So that makes total sense. But then there's more in the space framework that Dr. Nicole Forsgren has been also authoring. And that actually, I think there's a couple of interesting ones that are completely out of this world. For example, talking about the developer satisfaction and how they are experiencing these things. So that, of course, then becomes more of a survey. Again, it's not something you can get from Git, but when you combine that with Git data or any of this other data that we have at our disposal, it actually becomes more interesting, because then you can kind of say, how do developers experience this phenomena that's kind of visible in this data that we otherwise have? So I think, and that's the beauty of this idea behind space framework, that you're supposed to take these different types of metrics and look at them together. So if Dora was just about iteration speed and then controlling for quality, then here you're also taking in other organizational aspects, like how do we feel about this? Like, how strong is our culture? Like, do we have this kind of baseline of kind of good practices? Do we have these blameless retrospectives, whatever? And then they go a bit further also in terms of measuring individuals or measuring the outputs as well. That is a kind of hotly debated topic, whether you should be doing that. I think that there would be a place and time for some of these individual metrics in an extremely mature organization, but it's very rare to see any bigger organization that would be that mature to have a conversation about these things without someone kind of being concerned that it's used for evaluating them in a way that's not fair. So even though the space framework suggests that you should look at things at the individual level, team level, and organizational level, I would suggest that there's plenty of things to be done at the team and organizational level, rather than trying to go to the individual metrics just yet.
All right, so let me ask you a question then. How do you improve developer satisfaction now that management is happier having all those metrics?
Well, it seems to me that developer satisfaction is just one of those things that it's kind of similar to let's say, the reliability issues, that yes, you have to just survey what's going on. Like we actually had pretty good answers at Smartly from all of these employee surveys that we did. And for example, I had this specific way of, I had this kind of health check for teams, asking questions about different areas of being a development team, like do we have access to customers, and can we kind of can we make sure that we're building the right things and able to prototype quickly, and do we have these healthy practices and so on. And when you have these prompts and you're able to kind of make sure the teams cover all of these different areas, it will surface all kinds of topics that you need to work on. And many of these improvements might actually be something that's a pretty difficult technical problem. Like one of the things we ended up fixing was development environments. And when you have tens of microservices that you might need to work across, and you need to get, like every developer needs to fight with getting all of those up to date and talking to each other and so on, like that easily becomes a thing that affects your satisfaction at work even quite significantly. And if you're able to surface these kind of observations early, we're able to also solve them early. And that's the thing about growth companies, that you just have to fix whatever is broken, and you need to be really good at listening to those early signals and really good at reacting quickly.
All right, so reacting quickly. So let me ask you, and this is a question from the audience as well. How often do you think metrics should be reviewed and discussed within the teams?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it depends on many things, and many companies have a little bit different cadence overall how they like to run things. For example, I always like the weekly rhythm of running a company. So for example, every Monday morning we look at all the business metrics together with the whole team. Every Friday we have a company demo. That kind of sets the cycle of the company to a certain level. And if you want to be a fast moving company, that's kind of what you want, versus another company might do that once every quarter, and that of course sets the tone for the rest of it. But at the same time, going through some kind of developer metrics all the time might not be that productive. I would say starting your retrospectives with the ones that you are especially interested in is a good investment of time. It only takes a couple of minutes, and at that point you're going to be able to have better conversations in that retrospective. So you're not really taking time from the team for it, but you're actually just improving the quality of the discussion. So I would maybe suggest that as a starting point. And then it is useful to do a little bit of exploration every once in a while. And especially as a leader, I like to kind of just delve into this dashboard and just kind of just look at what can I find every once in a while, because it's interesting, and I like doing it, but we can't expect your developers to be doing that all the time.
Makes sense. We have a comment from Alex on the chat. I don't think tracking Dora at the individual level is a good practice. You win and improve as a team, and tracking per person will end up incentivizing the wrong behavior inside the team. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I totally agree. Dorametrics are not really meant to be tracked at an individual level. It's more that there's an extension to this discussion with the space framework and everything. So there might be some things that you might be able to measure at the individual level, but you're right that I wouldn't even go there for most organizations at all.
Makes sense. We're moving to the last phase of this conversation, which is the conclusion. So let's recap a little bit the key takeaways from the discussion. And now we did talk about the individual metrics. We did talk about how to define them. We did talk about the good enough level. What do you think would be the key elements that you'd like to leave this audience with from this talk?
Well, maybe I would start with kind of the time being now to start looking into this, because there's been a long history of software development being mostly like flying blind and being very subjective experience. You can accelerate learning with this stuff, and this has been validated across several organizations that there's a bunch of good stuff there. So maybe if the previous wisdom was to just ignore this topic because it's easy to go wrong, I would say now is a good time to start looking into this. it is still a complex matter. So everything we talked today about getting your teams on board, actually making sure that you're driving results, using this as a discussion starter rather than a metric that you're just trying to drive down. I think I would apply the same philosophy I apply to all ways of working. It's great to understand the research. It's great to know what are the alternatives out there, but still you need to build something for your own organization to solve your own problems, and start with kind of the minimal solutions and then move up as you mature. But it's not a competition of who gets the most metrics. That is not helpful. So for solving your own problems and helping the teams get better, that's what I would say.
Great takeaway. Yes, using Dorametrics as a conversation starter to, I suppose, identify the issues within the company, and then doing what's best for the company rather than over focusing, I suppose, on improving the number. Let me ask you a little bit about driving change within the whole organization. How can Dorametrics help drive large-scale change, so to say, and not just perhaps in development, but really across infrastructure development, perhaps other areas within the organization?
Yeah, I think one good thing is that it sets the tone to wanting to move fast, and kind of just highlighting how important it is that we focus on both the iteration speed and the quality of things, because many organizations don't talk about this, and that leads to engineers maybe not valuing stuff that would actually help everyone. For example, if I see something that helps our CI pipeline and like cuts 5 minutes from test runs from all developers, like that's a huge thing, and you should actually do this kind of improvements all the time. But if you don't have the mindset of focusing on this and seeing it as something important, your team might treat it as just a similar thing as kind of re-indenting some file in the source code, or like other refactoring that doesn't really produce that much value. So definitely, I think it's a good conversation to be had, and especially as a startup and growth company, you want to be moving fast. That is what kind of makes or breaks it in the market.
Sure. What resources would you recommend to people willing to find out more about Dorametrics? You mentioned the State of DevOps report already. What else would you recommend for someone willing to find out more what it is, how to apply the metrics in the organization?
Yeah, I just shared in the chat my blog post about measuring software development productivity. So it takes an attempt to describe holistically all the different aspects that you might be willing to look at, and then especially focusing on what are the questions you would ask from your team when you start driving this improvement. So that's kind of my best thinking on that topic to get started with.
Fantastic. That's great. Now, this audience is CTOs, executives, technology leaders. So what is the role of people at positions of leadership in introducing and utilizing Dorametrics?
Yeah, I think it's good to recognize that it is an important role that we have as CTOs, because there is this kind of school of thought that says that just hire the best people and get out of the way. But I think that's really not doing a service for the leadership roles, because it is important that you help build an environment where these teams can thrive. And especially if you're just an individual team member somewhere, it is pretty difficult to change a whole organization, to bring this kind of cultural shift of more openness and kind of inviting the transparency and building the tools or investing in tools to getting visibility to this stuff. So hiring the best people will not automatically fix all of your problems. So as a leader, it's your job to create that environment and create that culture for it. And this is exactly the kind of change that might feel uncomfortable. And when you have this type of changes, when it's an individual developer who doesn't have the social capital maybe to change everyone else's opinions about this, it's very easy to get stuck. And then you end up with an organization where nothing happens and it kind of remains as it was. And that's not a great place to be when you're a growth company, because there's going to be other types of external changes all the time, and you want to be able to react to them and move forward as an organization. So introducing something like this, I think, is exactly the role of the CTO, and something that will help create that better culture, create that better infrastructure, so that the teams will be more successful.
Fantastic. It's good to hear your opinions on this. I'd like to ask everyone, if you'd like to ask a question, it's the last opportunity. We only have a few minutes left. I wanted to ask you a little bit about job satisfaction. Does increasing delivery performance on its own actually influence job satisfaction?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually one of my kind of favorite things about these things, that like there is no cheat code for just delivering faster, except actually there is one, which is if you get developers to really discover something that they really want to build, and they kind of discover the problem, and then they are able to, they have the autonomy to build the solution, and they get to drive it forward. That's when you get people who are really engaged, and that's when you get people who are doing their best job. And you can see that, like I've seen several product innovations coming out from developers who just were exposed to customers, and they kind of built that customer empathy through those meetings. And then they had enough context for coming up with the solution, and they had the technical capability and for that, and the autonomy for it, and so on. And when you look at how quickly that work progresses versus something kind of more mundane, it tends to be that like the work is flying through the board at that point. And yeah, so if you can kind of build the environment that supports that, that is the cheat code for improving the developer productivity.
Fantastic. And this is going to be my last question. Is there anything else I haven't asked about that you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, I guess since we were sponsoring this, I have to mention that at Swarmia, we basically built the product version of the Accelerate book and the Space framework. So this is exactly what we're doing, and we are seeing great results from some growth companies. So, yeah, happy to have a discussion about this, just help you understand how to think about these metrics, if that's interest for anyone. And you can reach me on Twitter, and email is firstname@swarmia.com.
So thank you, Otto, for talking with us today. You can connect with our speaker after the event on the links. I'm going to share the chat in a moment. And thank you all for joining. I'd like to also let you know that next Friday at the same time, 12:30 GMT, we have another CTO Craft Bytes event, Compliance in the Cloud, Heaven or Hell. And I'm going to paste the links right now. Thank you all so much for joining, and see you next week.